Good morning. We're glad you're with us today as we start a new study. We're studying the life of Joseph. That may be my favorite character in all the Bible, partly because he is such a dramatic character and has so much happen to him that it would be hard to make it up if it didn't happen. And so we're going to look at Joseph for the next quarter, and today we're going to start with some beginning things. But I want you to look at these newspaper headlines. These are not current, by the way. I decided that the current ones are too bad to put up there, so I had to go back about 8 years. But I want you to look at these and just take them in for a moment. One said, "Alexa, shut up, raging against the new machines." Or, "Aurora man was jealous and controlling before the shooting," records say. "Taylor Swift, troubled relationship with revenge." You don't have no context of that. A lot of her hit songs are because her boyfriend broke up with her, and that's the way she got revenge, by making more money. Woman convicted of murder in ex-boyfriend's shooting death. Now, the question I want to ask you is, let me go backwards, with all those headlines is, what are they about? If you want to put a theme on all of these, here's the theme. Don't get mad, get even. And, that's kind of the way people are. Just think about road rage. You know what road rage is? I got ticked because somehow you didn't move fast enough or you changed lanes, so I get a chance to take it out on you. It's never even, by the way. And so these are things that if you were to say, this is what life is about, this is about getting even, that's what the book of Genesis in the life of Joseph is about. Does he get even or not? Now, why study the book of Joseph? And we're going to have some questions in between, but I need to get this out of the way first. Why study Joseph? Joseph's an interesting character, and but in terms of weightier matters, he may not be the one that you want to look at. However, the New Testament, when Paul writes the New Testament, he says, I want to tell you why these things exist. He says, what was written in the former days, was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of Scripture, we might have hope. He said, you've got to learn something from the past or you perish in the future. And that's an interesting idea, that everything that Joseph has, the Joseph story we're going to look at, teaches us something very valuable. And we learn best from others and their experiences. You don't have to pay for your mistakes. You can let other people pay for their mistakes and learn from them. The wise man does that. The fool says, I got to learn by myself. And he usually does in the worst possible way. So, we're going to study Joseph, but I want you to look at this. This is not, you may not care about stuff like this, but I thought it was interesting in that the book of Genesis, if you're not aware, the book of Genesis is a book that focuses on people and characters. It's not about events. Have you ever thought about that? It's about characters and what happens to them rather than all the things that happen. Sometimes we read Genesis the wrong way. If you look at this chart, what you find out is here's Adam and Noah. They take up this much space in the book of Genesis. And by the way, space usually means importance. The more time you dwell on something, the more important it becomes. You get to Abraham, it's a pretty good slice there. Now, poor old Isaac. Isaac's like the father of the bride. You know what the father of the bride does? He has 3 jobs. Show up, pay for everything, and get out of the way. That's 3 jobs. I mean, I've been the father of 2 brides. I understand that. And the mothers, they just chatter away. But the brides just chatter away. Dad, go over there and sit. That's kind of Isaac. He's always Abraham's son or Jacob's father. Kind of a stepchild, if you will. And so he doesn't get really much space. You get to Isaac and there's nothing there. Jacob gets a huge swath. There's an other up here. That's the folks like the genealogies, the Tower of Babel, those kind of things. They're there. But if you were to go and say, how about Joseph? That's the slice Joseph gets out of the book of Genesis. It's the biggest slice almost of anybody. He probably rivals Abraham and Jacob. That's how much space is given to Joseph. Now, Joseph, it could be argued, is not that central a character. Here's why. He is not, you don't refer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. It's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph doesn't even have his own tribe. His tribe is split between his sons, and two half-tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim come out of that. So you never see him in tribal maps either. It's like he comes and goes. Except he doesn't. That's the problem. And there are good reasons why Joseph's story is right here that we'll come into. We're going to talk about family trees. And so let me describe this. Now, do not try to guess the character. I will tell you the character in a moment. What I just told you is going to foul your mind up for the next 2 minutes, because you're going to start trying to find out who it is. I want you to watch and say, what kind of person would they become as an adult if you knew them? That's the question. First of all, this is a real person. His mother died at the age of 7. He was left as a 12-year-old sister for 2 years by themselves in the wilderness while the father left. Think about that. Your mother dies and suddenly you don't have anything to eat, and Dad says, I'll see you later. As he grew up, he fell in love with a woman who decided she'd run off and marry somebody else. Broke his heart. Or he wanted 3 different jobs, and he rejected those 3 jobs every time. He ended up marrying a woman who was insane. He had 2 children who died at young ages, which will crush you. And then on top of that, he suffered from crushing depression. I think I know why. The list above there. I'd add to it. Now the question is, what kind of person would that be? Now, what will surprise you to know is this mess of a person is the 16th president of the United States. How do you get to be there when you've got all that mess in your background? How does that happen? That's what we're going to try to look at over this series. Well, let me ask you, how has your family affected your life? They affect 2 ways. They can be positive and really kind of drive you nuts. That's an interesting question because it happens. No, because we're all reticent to talk about it. It's always easier to talk about somebody else. So let's gossip for a moment. This is a family tree of the actor Henry Fonda. Now, that's a complex chart. I understand it's a complex chart. I'm going to have to work through it. These are all the relationships that Henry Fonda had. He has a son, Peter, a daughter, Jane, a brother and his wife over here. He had a child that nobody knows about, basically, and friends all around there. What I found was interesting, he's related to the founder of Time magazine. And I'm trying to think, he's also related to Oscar Hammerstein, the Broadway music guy. Now, I want to add some things to it. Who you are in your family will determine what happens. Let me prove it. Let's start. His sister died by suicide in 1960. Let's go on. Another sister dies by suicide by slitting her throat in a mental hospital. Another in-law, Bridget, dies by suicide in the same year that his sister kills herself. And then you have one of his brothers dies in a car accident. And then you got a teenager who shot himself in 1950. You have a close friend of his son who died by suicide in February of 65. He had close friends, both who committed suicide. On top of that, uh, he didn't attend. Only Henry and his wife attended Francis's funeral. She's the one that committed suicide up there. And the children were never told of it. Family secret. And Henry performed that night. And then the family house burned down in California, tearing up everything they had for memorabilia. How would you like to be a Fonda? Here's the secret to the Fonda family. Now, I can show you John F. Kennedy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, George Washington. I got a bunch of these. Under pressure, the Fonda family commits suicide. Family trait. When life gets tough, make your exit. So if you're in that family, you better pay attention to how you're feeling. I guarantee you. Now, we could do your family this way, but you may not want to know all the skeletons in the closet. But the question is, and I want you to see if you can tackle this a little bit, what does it take to produce a faithful adult? This is the question. And I'm going to tell you, this is a paradoxical question. Because what we think it will take to create an effective adult is not what always happens. All of the books that say do this are right and wrong all at the same time. And so, that's the way it works. So we're going to look at Joseph. Jacob, let's start with Dad. Jacob has three defining characteristics, as we're going to see. The first thing, he is someone who deceives people. In fact, that's what his name means. You remember the story of his birth. He comes out of the birth canal, and he's holding on to the heel of his brother Esau, who comes out just moments before, and he's trying to pull him back in. His name means the one who grasps the heel, and that means to trip somebody up. His name really means someone who deceives. Remember, names create destinies. And that's who he would become. We're going to find out he does this all the time. He's also a wrestler. In Genesis chapter 32, they come to the river Jabbok. And the river Jabbok, we're going to talk about in just a moment what its significance is. But there on the banks before daylight, he wrestles with an angel, but he realizes at daybreak it's God. He's wrestling with God. I think he's wrestling with God his whole life. I think he's got this constant wrestling match with who he is, where he fits, what he does, and who God is. And am I more powerful than God, or can I manipulate God? I know people who have that kind of fight inside of them. They're struggling to find that out. He also is a very passive father, as we're going to see. He didn't do a lot of correction. He let things slide. He didn't want to hear about it. Don't tell me bad news. I don't want to hear those things. Peace at any price was his motto. And so you find this is his family. His family has an interesting characteristic. He has, as we're going to talk about all these people in some way, Leah and Rachel, who he married. Zilpah and Bilhah, who were given to him, they are the servants to bear children. We don't understand that fairly as common, as we found out with Abraham as well. Out of this, Leah has 6 kids. There are 12 kids. Wrong button. And these 6 kids, that's half of the family. But then you got Zilpah has 2 kids. Bilhah has 2 kids. Rachel has 2 kids, but one of them dies. One of them dies in all this. That's an interesting chart, isn't it? How'd you like to be part of that family? I knew a family one time that they had 4 kids living in the house with their father, with a woman who was not his wife, and not any of the 4 kids had the same mother. Now that does something to you. Who do you listen to when, for instance, let's assume Zebulun over here gets in trouble. I don't know why I was doing it. Zebulun gets in trouble, and Rachel scolds him. What is he going to say? You're not my mama. Ooh, that creates problems, doesn't it? You're not my mama. You can't tell me what to do. This had all kinds of things. Now, this was not uncommon having this many kids. My grandfather was the youngest of 10 children. And the reason was they worked the fields. And that's called labor, free labor. And so that's what they would do. Our modern society, if you have 10 kids, there's a word for that, broke. And that's why birth rates are declining right now. But all of these people will touch on in some way. The other thing that happens is when Jacob goes to get a wife, he's sent over to his father-in-law, and he sees his father-in-law, his prospective father-in-law, has two daughters. One is Leah, who is called weak-eyed. I have all kinds of ideas what that is that I won't share right now. But it says that he saw the other one. Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance, and Jacob loved Rachel. Are you aware? Nowhere in all of Genesis does it say that Jacob ever loved Leah. Wow. One loved, one just not really despised, but at least ignored. They were in the way. And the problem came out that he didn't get what he wanted. He said, I will work for her for 7 years. And it says that it seemed to him but a few days, for he loved her so much. At the end of 7 years, the wedding feast comes, and you know the story that on the wedding night, they take the veil off, and all of a sudden, he's got the sister. And now he has to do what? He goes and says, I love this. He said, you cheated me. You deceived me. Wow. A guy who's a deceiver is complaining about being deceived. I love irony. And so he says, well, that's not how we do things in this part of the woods. And so, but if you want to work another 7 years, you can go and have Rachel now. But, you know, so for 14 years he works in kind of a forced slavery, if you will. And so Jacob goes through this pattern. So what you have is you have 2 wives. One loved, one not loved. One forced, one taken. That's called a recipe for disaster because one is favored. Just ask grandfather or great-grandfather Abraham, who has a wife named Sarah who decides to try to help God by getting a handmaid named Hagar, and they become rivals. Story continues. So the Jacob's family ends up looking like this over time, and it provides all kinds of dynamics. Well, let's look at some family pictures. Everybody has pictures. Say, let me show you what our family looks like. You do know that when you show pictures of your family, they are all smiling. Genesis shows us the bad wall. First of all, the birth of Joseph comes. Over time, Leah could spit out children like a rabbit. And then all of a sudden, Rachel just couldn't. She said she just couldn't. And because fertility was prized, because it gave more labor, Leah got more attention. Rachel got jealous. She got hurt. And so she prays to God, and finally God opens her womb, it says, and said, God has taken away my reproach. She has a child named Joseph. May he add to me another son. Everything looks good now. Oh, the problem is, Leah says, I'm not going to be outdone. So she gets her handmaiden, and she starts giving Jacob kids. Eclipses the idea. So he has a mother who finally has a child after all those years. Mothers who have a child who couldn't have a child, there's something special about that relationship. but all of his siblings are older. I'm suggesting the siblings are all at least 20 years older. My daughter, when she went to college, she had a friend down the hall that the day she graduated from high school, the last child graduated from high school, her mother had a baby. Interesting idea. There's a reason God gave young people children and gave old people grandchildren, because we have cars to take them home. So how do you think that affected family dynamics? Poorly. This is a weird idea. You got all these grown men, this little kid running around, and he's not even relate. He didn't come from your mother. He's now in the way. Whew. Doesn't feel good. The second picture we're going to look at is a picture called Tense Relocation. He's a child. I don't know how old Joseph is. Not very old, though. I know that. He can't be, because of the sequence of events in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 31, Jacob has cheated his father-in-law more times than his father-in-law wants to admit. He's manipulated the flock, so he's gotten rich at the expense of his father-in-law. And it's time for him to say, this isn't going to work out, and we're going to go back home. And then when he goes back home, Rachel has hidden a family totem under her saddle, and so she's kind of stealing from the family, and they discover it, and I mean, he's sneaking out in the middle of the night to keep from getting caught, all kinds of stuff. And think about what that means. And he get caught, and that's even tenser. And as Genesis 32, as he's going back home, he hears that Esau is roaming the hillside looking for him, and he is not Elsa. He has not let it go. He still remembers that day he got cheated out of the birthright and swore he's ever kill him if he saw him again. And so behind him, he's got a man who's mad at him. In front of him, he's got a man who's mad at him. And this whole family's making their way, hoping they don't get killed somewhere along the way. It says that Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. They're making this trip under duress. Doesn't feel good. And so you got all of that. Then you have the rape of his sister. In Genesis 34, Dinah, one of the daughters. So Dinah just comes along, and she's out there. They've gotten back into the promised land. They got back into Canaan, and she's wandering around. She's gone into town, and one of the princes of the town named Shechem sees her, falls in love with her, but he decides he's going to rape her. He rapes her, and it says that now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah. But he doesn't do a thing about it. Now the sons do. They come back and they exact revenge, and creates a problem with living with your neighbors. That would have been a tense relationship anyway. Now, if you think all this is bad, I want you to think about, we always think, here's what we think. We think in the Bible you have these perfect families. We have the model of what fathers and mothers ought to be. All you've got to do is read it, and it'll show you what a father and mother are supposed to be. Do you realize there are more dysfunctional families in the Bible than almost anywhere else? The Bible's littered with men of great faith who failed as fathers. Now, it took me getting to be a father to understand that, because we all make mistakes that we hold the rest of our lives with. But these could be critical. Think about things. Eli, who raised Samuel, has two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who were called worthless. You have Samuel, who comes along, and the reason the people ask for a king is because his kids, Samuel's kids, are worthless. They don't want them to rule. And then you've got David, who's got a hot mess of a group, of a son who rapes a sister, of another son who takes revenge on the brother by killing him, and then that son tries to take over the father's kingdom. Now, that's a healthy American family. That's a leave it to Beaver moment. And then you come to another one called the death of a mother. They go on from Bethel. They're headed toward Bethlehem. It calls it Ephrathah here. And that's Micah 5, Micah tells us that too. But it says they journeyed from Bethlehem. When they were some distance from it, Rachel went into labor, and it was hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said, "Don't fear, you'll have another son." She sees the child being delivered. But as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. What happens is that his mother, the only one who is really his, dies, giving birth to a brother. They buried her in Bethlehem. Today, there is this structure, and it is called Rachel's tomb. And it says they put up a pillar over the tomb. It's the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. In Hebrew, that word right there is Rachel. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what the tour guide will charge you $50 for. And so there's some credence to this. The next picture is called incest. Boy, you just can't get a break in that family, can you? Incest can create all kinds of problems. You have, in this story, right here in Genesis 35, you have this son, Reuben, who is the oldest son, who's the one who's going to inherit the father's fortune, who is going to be supposedly the one who will carry the promise of God. That's how it worked. He goes in and he basically rapes Bilhah, at least he sleeps with her. And it says that Jacob heard about it. And he didn't do anything about it. He didn't say anything. It's the elephant in the room. For years, it was the elephant in the room. Nobody said anything about it. It's only on the deathbed that Jacob comes and says, "Let me tell you about what I know about you, Reuben." This is the part where he's blessing his kids. This is not much of a blessing, by the way. He says, "Unstable as water, you could stir him with a stick and he would create a whirlpool. You shall not have preeminence because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it." First mention he ever makes of that act that we just read about. You will not have preeminence. A lot of short fuses. He knew that showed utter contempt for him. Tells you how his kids felt about it. On top of that, the last picture we're going to look at, and it's got to be quick, is spoiled child. Now, here's his statement in Genesis 37. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. I've told you the story about my granddaughter keeps asking my wife, "Who's your favorite grandchild?" And she has a clever way of avoiding it. Says, "You're my favorite, Ellie." Now, last week, every time we get that question. And she wants to know who's the favorite. And she said, "No, I don't want that question. Which grandchild of yours is your absolute favorite?" Don't ever answer that question. And so, it was very apparent, though, because it says that he made for him a robe of many colors, and that's really not the best translation of that. He made him a robe with long sleeves. A long robe with long sleeves. You know what that means? That means you don't have to go work out in the fields because you don't work with long sleeves. You work with short sleeves, so your arms are free. His brothers saw that coat and they go, "Yeah, you know what we are, chopped liver." That twists a lot of things. Now, by any measure, Joseph should have grown up to be a mess. His mother dies in childbirth with his brother. He's hated by his siblings. His father barely gives attention to the family. He never addresses the problems. He never corrects anything. You've got all these sexual things that are going inside the family that's creating tension and all. And he grows up in that environment. I wouldn't want to write a book on how to raise children. The answer would be, make sure there's plenty of trouble in your house. He'll grow up to be a great guy. That's the exception, not the rule. However, there are three things that shape character. One thing that shapes character is your family. Whether you like it or not, your family has done things for you or to you. I've known families that have gone both ways. Families are families. You can't get rid of your family heritage. You can't get rid of your raising. It's just true. This is a gravity problem. A gravity problem simply is something you can do absolutely nothing about. It's like if I jumped off this stage, I couldn't float because I can't do anything about gravity. It's going to make me come down. This is a gravity problem. Whoever you are has been shaped by your mother, your father, your brothers, and your sisters. Some of those were not great. And I know a lot of people that blame their life on their families. Your family's contributed. That's all you can say. The second thing is your times. Think about your times. If you grew up during the Great Depression, you don't throw things away. You know why? I might need this. I remember a story about an Austrian psychotherapist who spent 4 years in a concentration camp in Germany. When he was released at the end of the war, he was skin and bones, barely alive. He hadn't eaten in days. When he did eat, the bread was moldy and hard and old. And they said for the rest of his life, every time he walked past a bread shop in Vienna, he'd go in and he'd buy all the bread out of the shop and take it home. And the bread would rot, it would mold, it would ruin, he'd throw it away. And he kept accumulating bread. Why? I am never going to be hungry again. Your times shape you. Think about what that means for today. If you have a child who's been born since the year 2000 and they've grown up in a time of social media, how is that going to produce? What kind of adult will that produce? Ooh, it shivers up my spine because I know what kind of adults we got that use it. So those are the two things that are there. And the third thing, though, are your choices. Where you go to school, what you're going to major in, what kind of job you're going to have, who you're going to marry, where you're going to live, what church you're going to attend, are you going to be faithful or not, what kind of car you're going to drive, how much money do you want to pursue. They're all there, all those choices. We had a full set of Wednesday nights on life choices. And so but those are the choices. Now here's the kicker. You can't change your family, and you can't change your times. You can make better choices. The only part of Joseph's life he has any effect on is what goes on between his ears. He's going to find himself encapsulated in times he cannot change. He's part of a family that is just really a mess. And so he has to overcome his family. I like this passage in James because it tells us about Joseph. Joseph is forged by crisis. The story of Joseph is a story of crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. But he becomes a sterling example of faith. He doesn't live out the plot that has been written for him by his family. James says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." He gets trials of various kinds, as we're going to see. "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." You can't get steadfastness if you don't get testing. You know what one of the secrets of happiness is? Suffer. Because only when you overcome things can you be happy. The person who wants to sit in his easy chair and come to is the most miserable person in the world. Look at any billionaire. They're twisted people. Because they don't have a challenge. And so Joseph has to take on the challenge. And here's this boy coming out of this family, all kinds of troubles in the background, and suddenly he is face to face with life.